giving the United States the tools that it needs to assess the threat of foreign-owned technology and, where appropriate, to take steps to restrict access.
A group of bipartisan U.S. senators, including Democrat Tammy Baldwin, unveiling a new bill this past week that would give the Biden administration the power to ban TikTok in the U.S. The White House quickly backed that legislation.
Now, several proposals targeting TikTok, which is owned by the Chinese company ByteDance, now before Congress as lawmakers, including Wisconsin Congressman Mike Gallagher, chair of the new Select Committee on China, intensify their scrutiny of the popular social media app.
And now, right here, TikTok is responding. Brooke Oberweiter is head of policy communications for the Americas. She joins us now from Washington. Brooke, thanks so much for coming on the show. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with that new bill in the Senate backed by the White House. What does TikTok make of that?
Well, we're obviously tracking a lot of things that are going on in Washington right now with respect to TikTok. This most recent legislation, I think, notably doesn't mention TikTok by name and sort of lays out a process by which the administration can take action against foreign companies of concern. But what I think is important about TikTok specifically is that it's a platform that's beloved by over 100 million Americans. So obviously anything that happens right now in Washington is going to need to take that into account as they're considering legislation that could potentially ban a service that's not just loved by Americans, but that gives them an outlet for free protected speech.
I know previously you and lawmakers have referenced this ongoing review and 2+ years of negotiations now between TikTok and the U.S., the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., meant to result in some type of security deal down the road. Curious from your perspective, where does that stand right now and how far is TikTok willing to go?
We're really pleased with the work that was done in negotiating a proposed agreement with CFIUS. What we came up with, which we refer to internally as Project Texas, is a comprehensive suite of initiatives that would help protect the platform beyond a shadow of a doubt for our U.S. users, making sure that U.S. user data is protected, that the systems that power TikTok, the algorithm, the For You feed, content moderation is all overseen and managed by Americans in the United States, protected in the Oracle Cloud environment. So we're really proud of the fruits of those discussions.
Where are the roadblocks from your perspective in implementing that now?
It's a good question. I think from our perspective, we're doing everything that we can to go ahead and implement the things that we've committed to. So we've reached several milestones in this project over the last year or so. We've stood up a new subsidiary within TikTok called TikTok US Data Security. That team is staffed only by vetted US personnel, and they are the ones who are going to be managing access and oversight to all that user data. We have moved people into that new subsidiary. Since June of last year, all new TikTok user traffic has been routed by default to that protected environment. So it has not gone through TikTok or ByteDance servers. It goes directly through Oracle, an American-based cloud service provider. So we're really proud of the work that we've already done. There's obviously more that we can do and more that we'd love to be able to do in partnership with the United States government to protect Americans.
Is there any talk of a sale of TikTok to a U.S. company?
We're focused right now really on the CFIUS negotiation and implementing the things that we can.
As you know, Wisconsin Congressman Mike Gallagher, chair of the new Select Committee on China, on this show has called for a nationwide ban as part of his proposed legislation. He's promising more upcoming hearings on the China committee. To his concern that he's addressed publicly, can you guarantee the Chinese government has not access to any U.S. data through ByteDance?
Sure. As we've said many times before, we have never been asked for, nor have we shared U.S. user data with the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party. What we're building through Project Texas, however, is designed to explicitly address that concern of Representative Gallagher's, to make sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that there are no backdoors in the software, there is no system access, there is no data leakage by which people outside of this new entity, TikTok USDS, could gain access to user data. So the concerns he's raising, we certainly understand them. We are building a solution that is meant specifically to address them, that's tailor-made to speak to those very issues.
But can you guarantee that the Chinese government has not accessed any U.S. data?
I don't think any company could guarantee beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Chinese government hasn't accessed their data. We see stories all the time of hacking intrusions and things that, data being sold on the open market. I think what we can say is that TikTok has not and would not shared that data with the Chinese government.
Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers recently banned TikTok on government devices here in the state. The University of Wisconsin system did the same on their devices. Was that the right move?
I leave it to executive branches to determine what's right for the state-owned devices that are under their purview. I don't necessarily think that a lot of those decisions were made based on accurate data or accurate information about TikTok and our company. Most of them seem to have been spurred more or less by headlines than any actual credible intelligence about the security of the TikTok platform. But certainly where I start to get concerned is less about state devices and more about things that are happening at universities, where you have students who use TikTok every day as a source of information. They might use it as a source of learning. And right now what we're doing is we're cutting them off from that tool, from that resource, which is a big part of how they experience the world. So I think there's a lot of problem there when you take those state device bans and apply them more broadly to state networks.
When you look at university systems like Wisconsin or governors who are looking to U.S. intelligence officials, the FBI, who has expressed concerns, member of Congress, are they wrong in those concerns?
We certainly understand the concerns. I think they're wrong to suggest that there's any sort of credible intelligence that requires sort of this kind of broad action right now. There actually was a report from Al Jazeera, of all places, that had done some Freedom of Information Act requests in multiple states, trying to figure out how they came to these conclusions. How did they decide that they needed to ban TikTok? And in the state of Connecticut, they reached out to their local FBI, who reached out to the national FBI, and they said, we don't have any data for you. We think these bans are largely based on headlines. So certainly there are people from the FBI, from the Department of Justice, throughout Washington who are saying things about TikTok. What they aren't saying is that they believe that this is actively happening, nor are they providing any evidence that it is. It right now is a lot of hypothetical.
Brooke Oberwetter, Head of Policy Communications for the Americas at TikTok. Brooke, thank you so much for your time and your perspective. Good to see you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
A lot more ahead on this in the coming days in Washington. TikTok's chief executive scheduled to appear before Congress next week.
Up next, Wisconsin going big in Texas. The delegation at South by Southwest this weekend and their new pitch next.